Welcome to Parker Mill County Park. This site offers a beautiful wooded trail that encompasses the tail end of Fleming Creek, including its mouth where it joins the Huron River. A paved trail also joins Parker Mill with Gallup Park and Matha Botanical Gardens. However, the real treasure of the park is historic operating grist mill. The grist mill is over 140 years old and named after the family that built it. The oldest photo we have on file is from 1917. You'll notice how modern life has changed the surroundings, but inside, the mill still holds the look and feel of when it was built, preserving a piece of our local history. The mill was built by the Parker family. The Parker family consisted of William, Mary, and their children. They came over here from England in 1861 using money that Mary had saved while being a maid. It wasn't until a couple years later that they were able to purchase these 61 acres that we're standing on today. And then about 10 years later after that is when William Parker built the actual mill that we're standing in. William ran the mill for his own farm and family needs, and probably several of his neighbors too. When he passed away in 1910, his son George took over running the mill. George expanded operations a bit. He was also grinding grain for personal use, but was also taking in even more grain from the community, as well as selling products commercially in grocery stores. He ran and operated the mill until he passed away in 1956. After that, a couple of his sons and a few family members were running the mill, but then by 1960 the mill closed down. It sat vacant and untouched for about 20 years until Washtenaw County Parks was able to purchase the land and the buildings with millage money as well as land trust fund. They worked on restoring it, and by 1984 the mill was open to the public, and here we are 30 years later able to enjoy a glimpse into the past. The Parkers used this mill to grind grist. Well, what is grist? Grist is another word for grain. The seeds of plants like wheat, corn, rye, mostly grass plants. Seeds that humans have used for thousands of years to make flour used in various kinds of foods. A grist mill is a building that houses machinery that was designed or invented to grind the grain into flour. People have ground grain for thousands of years, but only recently in the last few hundred years did humans invent machines and design ways to run those machines that made the job of grinding grain much easier than it had been. So what would have operations look like if you were to come to the mill when George was running it? Let's say your family had corn and you needed ground up. You would come through these front doors and you would have your corn weighed on the scale. However, you couldn't bring your corn like this on the cob. You had to bring it shelled, which means just having the kernels off. And you would have had to do that initially by hand, but eventually machines were invented to make it easier. And so this is a sheller that we have here. So corn would get put into here, and there most likely would have been some type of contraption to load corn in to have it just slowly fall through. And there's a handle on the side by me, and you give it a spin, and there's big gears in there with teeth, and they run over the corn, knocking off all the kernels. Once the corn was weighed and you figure out how much money you owe Mr. Parker, from there he would take his corn and he would drop it into this hopper. And from the hopper, it goes downstairs, it drops into another hopper, and then it will fall into the grinding stones. And the grinding stones has one that sits still called your bedstone and one that spins called your running stone. And the running stone moves over the bedstone and grinds up that corn. It eventually will get pushed into a chute where it will get scooped up by a bucket elevator. The bucket elevator looks similar to this. This one's obviously a little old, but it's a belt with little scoops on it, and it would scoop up the corn that's been ground up. So once the corn goes through the stones, it would get picked up by a bucket elevator, which would come up and over here through that chute downstairs into the sifter, and the sifter would sort it out into corn flour, corn meal, and tailings. And tailings gets its name because it comes out the tail end of that sifter. And they're a bit too big and too hard for humans to eat, but they were great for animal feed. Along with corn, the Parkers also ground wheat, which would have been on this half of the mill. Wheat takes a few more steps, and because of the fragile nature of the sifter for the wheat side, this isn't operational. But much like the corn, you couldn't bring it on the stalk. You'd have to go through something called threshing and cleaning the wheat until you brought it to Mr. Parker. And then the wheat gets dropped into a hopper, picked up by a bucket elevator, just like our corn was, dropped in to an extra machine called a cleaner or smutter, where it goes through a series of screens that jostle and shake the seeds around. And there's a fan inside it which would blow out any extra plant debris, stones, maybe even insects, and shoot it out the side of the building. If we could go back in time, say 1917, the year of the old photo, we could stand outside down in the lawn below and look up and see all the chaff and dust come flying outside. Now, let's head down to the lower portion of the mill to see the final stop for the grain and what powered the mill. Once it comes downstairs, that's where a lot of the grinding action happens. So it would fall from the hopper upstairs into the second hopper. There is below that a flow apparatus which would control how fast it'll fall into the grinding stones, which are hidden in this hoop here. And the hoop just keeps the corn from flying all over the place. From there, it would get pushed, the corn would get pushed into this kind of storage well down here, scooped up by that bucket elevator that we talked about, go up, and it would go all the way back upstairs, come down through that diagonal chute that we saw, and land into the sifter up here. And this gets spun around, and smallest particles will fall first. So your flour will fall into this chute here, and then your cornmeal, and then lastly your tailings. So Mr. Parker wouldn't have had metal cans underneath the chutes. He would have had sacks. And there's even a little hook on here where he would have hooked the sack so it would stay on. And once it gets filled, if he needs to, these are sort of your shut-off valves. So you can push this in, stops corn flowing through. He can take the sack off, tie it off, put a new one on, open back up, and the corn would fall through. So let's turn the mill on and see what happens. So how did this mill run? Today, most of our mills would be run by electricity, but back when this mill was operational, it was using water power. So there originally would have been a dam underneath Getty's Road, and that would have created a large pond on the opposite side of it. And from that pond, the water would travel through a tunnel underneath the road, underneath the building here, underneath my feet. And this water gate control here would lift up a gate to allow water to flow through over a turbine, spinning the main drive shaft, and that would run everything in the mill. The Parkers did also build a cider mill, which is directly behind the grist mill. However, there was an apple blight, and instead converted the cider building to storage and an auxiliary wheat cleaning building. You'll also notice when visiting the park a small log cabin. The Parkers did not live in this particular cabin, but did live in something similar when first moving to the property. Eventually, they built a large stone house that can be seen today on the corner of Getty's and Dixboro. The Parkers used this cabin for storage. However, it's been set up to try and imagine what life would be like in the cabin. Parker Mill was an important part of Washtenaw County for some 70 years, providing a service for farmers and consumers. Today, Parker Mill still provides a service, not by grinding corn for us or our animals, but by giving us a moment to appreciate and understand a bit of our history.